Queen Matilda of Flanders, overshadowed by her more famous granddaughter of the same name, was atypical for a woman of her time. She had immense sway, refusing to be cowed by her often violent Norman husband. She was more than just the wife of the Conqueror. She was one of the most influential and powerful women in Europe. And this is her story. Before I continue, I will say at once that we're going to go on a bit of a tangent here. Quite a long one, in fact. Around 5 minutes-ish, give or take an hour. Kidding. Because Matilda's story wouldn't be complete without this, as it gives context, plus an excuse for me to bark on about a battle. And during this, Matilda herself is in Rouen, nervously awaiting any news of this, dreading whatever letter the messenger will bring. Anyway, let's go on with this tangent, shall we? Matilda's family are cursed by a brutal civil war between father and son. After years of being denied power, Robert of Normandy has finally risen up in rebellion, initially aided by his mother, and after conducting a series of lightning raids on the Norman border, the rebels were now holed up at Château Gerberoy, a French fortress under the siege from his conqueror father. Now, William is a brutal bully of a father who no longer saw him as a son, just another futile rebel in need of extinguishing. For 3 weeks, William's forces have been battering the defences of the castle. And where once the French had aided Robert, they had been bribed by William, and now Robert of Normandy was on his own. And this rebellion was sure to fail, so, left with no choice, and only doom on the horizon, Robert donned his armour, saddled his horse, and sallied forth out of the castle gates to meet his conqueror father in person, his men behind him. The battle raged, father versus son, and William, driven by fury, fought like a man in his prime, besting his much younger opponents. Many fell beneath his blade. The fighting wasn't going to be easy though, and heavy casualties were mounting up on both sides. One of the wounded was the king's other son, William Rufus, himself an accomplished knight, though he would live to fight another day. This was no easy battle. The Conqueror had not fought this hard since 1066, and, like at Hastings, his horse fell beneath him. Still he fought on. A second horse was also shot, this time by a crossbow bolt. Still the battle raged, and William fought on undaunted. A third horse, back in the fray, determined to win at all costs. But finally, he had met his match. Behold, a heavily armoured opponent that proved too much for him to handle. They both knew each other's strikes, countering and outmanoeuvring. After trading blows, this relentless rebel knight finally drove the Conqueror back, injuring him in the arm, forcing William to retreat. He had been beaten by his son, Robert of Normandy, the leader of the rebellion. Legend has it that when William cried out in pain, it was thus that Robert learnt that it was his father. An unlikely story. William was very distinctive, as was Robert. They would most likely have been aware of each other from the outset, possibly even seeking each other out, issuing challenges. They would have sparred together in the past, been familiar with each other's patterns. Hence the situation. Robert of Normandy then demanded the king leave the field of battle, thus sparing his life. A mercy that would not have been granted by his father. and this was only the second time the Conqueror suffered defeat. His reputation as a warrior was legendary, now bested by his son. Humiliated, the king was forced to head back to Rouen, where he stewed over what had happened. And Robert also abandoned Chateau Gerberoy, retreating back to Flanders, to his cousin and ally, the Count. So, where did Matilda stand in all of this? Her husband beaten by her son? There was no way she could rejoice, other than both were alive, and another son was wounded but not dead. She must have been worried sick about what had occurred, for even though none of her family perished in the battle, this was only going to be the beginning. William would never let Robert win. There was even a good chance he'll try and kill him. In fact, he plans on it, even invoking laws set by Moses. Robert is deserving of death. Olderic Vitalis tells of a hermit. It's most likely a fabrication or embellishment written many years after the fact. But nonetheless, here it goes. Nothing Matilda was saying was getting through to William. His mind bent on revenge. Still, she's undaunted as ever and refusing to let any of them tear the family apart further. Enter the hermit, who Matilda hopes will aid her and foresee the best outcome. Matilda didn't visit this hermit personally. No, she sends her messengers. And the hermit tells her to wait 3 days. Once these 3 days had passed, he told her what he'd seen. Visions that told of a dark future in Normandy. There was a meadow with a lush of grass and flowers. There was a horse, some cattle. Only the horse drove off the cattle, preventing them from eating. And then one day the horse falls dead. Now the cattle has come back and eat the garden to ruin. The hermit told that Robert would be a bad Duke of Normandy. He went further. But it's a fanciful tale, written by Vitalis years after the event. Though, I will add that it's the prophecy that's in question, not the hermit himself. Matilda has been known for contacting religious figures as well as engaging in superstition. So seeking out a hermit fits in with all of this. As for what he said, and it goes into a lot more detail from what I mentioned, for all we know, the royal situation could have been easy to predict, like modern day royal squabbles and fallouts. You don't need a crystal ball to guess what's going on between Prince Harry and the King, and the royal family, etc. For all we know, it could have been an educated guess, but most likely it was embellished by Vitalis years later. Added, probably, only to foreshadow what happens next, because the Normans were currently on top of the world, but fractured. For this was no longer a family quarrel. It had escalated into a full civil war. The older soldiers tended to side with William, while their sons supported Robert. This weakened Normandy, rendering it vulnerable from Philip of France and the Duke of Anjou. Previously an ally, everything built was falling apart. And it wasn't just confined to the courts of warring magnates. No, even Matilda's personal friends network was embroiled in all of this. That year, in the cold night of early December of 1079, Mabel of Belém was having a bath. However, she was unaware that 3 men had entered the castle. 2 years prior, she had stolen lands from Hubernel, a knight. Remember that Mabel isn't just anyone. She's the wife of Roger Montgomery, the Conqueror's right-hand man. She often travels with an army, and is known for poisoning her enemies, if you believe the rumours. Her reputation is one of wickedness, and Hubernel vowed revenge. He and his brothers now snuck into her solar with murder on their minds. They waited. No sooner had she hopped out of the tub, the men brandished their daggers and pounced. She never stood a chance. Mabel de Bellem was stabbed to death that night. Then, to make sure that she'd never draw breath again, Hubernel cuts off her head for good measure. Thus ends the story of Mabel of Bellem. And Mabel wasn't the only death. Though thankfully this time it wasn't with malice or ill intent. And it was something that Matilda had no doubt been preparing for some time. For earlier this year, in 1079, Matilda's mother, Adela of France, passed away at the Abbey of Messines in modern-day Belgium. We do not know exactly how she died, but she was in her 70s. As a bit of backstory, upon the passing of her husband, soon after the conquest, Adela had travelled to Rome. And there, she had taken her vows as a nun. She had taken the veil from Pope Alexander II himself. And in later years, she'd be honoured as a saint. And the feast day of St. Adela of France is the 8th of September. Now, Matilda's reaction to this is unrecorded, but given that upon her own father's death, she is said to have been beside herself with grief, so we can only assume it was the same here or similar. Though we don't know if she travelled to the funeral or anything, nothing seems to be recorded. But Matilda must have reflected on the parallels between her family in Normandy, who was tearing itself apart, and her family in Flanders. As there, on the death of her father, her brothers also fought, and one had slain the other. This could not happen to her own sons, should anything happen to William. And William Rufus was already at war with Robert. She needed to reunite the family. But the problem is, William doesn't trust her, and nor does Robert by now, so Matilda does what Matilda does best. She flexes her political influence, first gaining the assistance of a powerful cabal of figures, such as the former Count Simon of Amiens, an ex-soldier become monk. That's just the beginning. You've got Roger Montgomery, the husband to the unfortunate Mabel, an old advisor to Matilda. He intervened, as did Pope Gregory VII. Matilda may have even reached out to her nephew, Philip of France. Even at this stage, given her recent predicament and all she's suffered, she seems to still have a considerable amount of sway. And she's intent on mending relations with her husband and her eldest son, because it's not just her family that's at stake, it's the kingdom, it's her legacy. Matilda's cabal of advisors urge Robert to get rid of unwise counsel, people who would see him opposed to his father. And eventually, Robert sees reason and agrees to parley with William the Conqueror in Rouen in the April of 1080. A formal reconciliation occurred under the backdrop of that year's Easter celebrations. Everyone important was there, both local and overseas, ensuring that word would travel fast that stability had been restored to the region. And things seemed to be going well. The main thing cooling the mood was King William's begrudging promise to restore Robert as heir to Normandy. Not the kingdom, that would be pushing it too far, but Normandy was nothing to sneer at, so Robert would still become Duke. But there were cracks in the seams. Behind all the pomp and circumstance, Robert's resentment continued to simmer. Though in all honesty this was a two-way street, as the Conqueror still disliked his son, taking every opportunity to insult him when he could. The same jibe as always, calling him Curtos. So it must have felt more like a ceasefire than a declaration of peace. And father and son wouldn't meet again, that we know of, until July, where they would oversee the signing of a charter at Caen. But right now, Matilda's eldest daughter, Adela, was to marry Stephen, the son of Theobald, Count of Blois. Blois itself was a hostile region, and this would prove a good truce for the future, and strategic enough to keep the French in check. Now, Adela is around 20, more or less. You know what the dates are like in this period in time. And Stephen around 10 years her senior. You can only imagine what the wedding was like, as lavish as everything the Normans did. And this marriage would prove a turning point in British history, as Adela would soon give birth to a son, also called Stephen. One day, this boy would grow into a man and clash with his cousin, the daughter of Adela's brother Henry, in a war known as the Anarchy. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, and we'll get to Henry in a bit. But as far as Matilda was concerned, the rebellion was over. Her work was done. It was now up to her husband and son to get the memo. Hopefully, one day, it would sink in. And it may have been working to some extent, as William travels to England for the first time in 4 years. But still, he's not trusting Matilda or Robert enough not to pull any more shenanigans, so he takes them both to England with him. It would have also looked like the family could be seen together as one unit for a change, putting any rumours to bed. You know what the rumour mill's like. Unfortunately, we do not know who's left in charge of Normandy, but I can imagine it being Roger Montgomery or Bishop Odo, or both, something like that. It may have even been Rufus, we don't know. But in England, it was the usual routine: Christmas at Gloucester, Easter at Winchester and Whitsun. At Whitsun, they'd get to show off their crown wearings in the classic Norman style, all the old pomp and circumstance that we are familiar with. It's like the good old days are back. While William was travelling to other parts of his domain, Matilda met with Queen Margaret of Scotland, who had travelled south. They had not seen each other since the coronation 12 years ago. Now, Queen Margaret had a daughter, Edith, a baby, who, in honour of Matilda of Flanders, had renamed Edith as Matilda. and the Scottish Queen wanted the Queen of England as the godparent. Now, legend has it that at the baptism, the baby Matilda grabbed Queen Matilda's veil, tugging it towards her, an omen for the future, because one day this little baby would marry a king and become a great queen. Again, this is probably written with hindsight, but a good story nonetheless, though anyone who's around babies would know they grab just about anything, especially hair and veils, so this tale does have some degree of truth, most likely a coincidence. But this birth would prove another turning point in British history, as this baby, this Edith/Matilda, would one day marry William and Matilda's youngest son, Henry. Right, you see where I'm going. Henry and Matilda, in the future, will one day have their own daughter, and they would call that daughter Matilda. And this very famous granddaughter would one day become an empress and quarrel with her cousin Stephen in the war known as the Anarchy. While Matilda is in England, she suddenly displays some uncharacteristic behaviour. We all know just how religious she is and how devout she's seen in the public eye. But now she takes it to a whole new level. The next couple of years, to be honest. She's doing some very charitable work, just on a different scale as before. For instance, she donated the income of the village of Brixton Deverill in Wiltshire to the church. She donated the actual village of Frampton in Dorset to an abbey. Matilda is dedicating an exceeding amount of time to the church. The next year, in the May of 1081, William is in Winchester again at Pentecost. All of his sons were there, as was Matilda. This year, her charity knew no bounds. And as we know from the past, when Matilda left England, England saddened. And that autumn, 1081, King William returned to Normandy, along with his wife and son Robert. It would prove the last time Matilda would ever see England again. And no sooner had she arrived in Normandy, Matilda visited the Abbey of Évreux in Bayeux. After spending some time with the clergy, she left the abbey. But before she did, Matilda placed a gold piece, a mark, on the table, asking them to pray for both her and her daughter Constance. But we do not understand the context of this. It's quite a lot of money. Okay, not for Matilda maybe, but for reference, a mark is worth around 160 pence, while a pound is worth 240 pence. It's a lot of money. Was her daughter Constance ill? It would certainly be a cause for concern, as by now her eldest daughter, Adeliza, was most certainly dead. And her other daughter, Matilda, may also have passed away around this time. She dies somewhere in the early to mid-80s. So by now she's probably lost a couple of daughters. There could be a whole host of reasons why Matilda would be penitent at this time. And it isn't just the estates I've mentioned that she donates to the church. There is a whole lot more. All her donations to La Trinité alone would be worth around £500 million in today's money. Something was certainly going on. The reason I say it might be health related isn't just out of Matilda's paranoia of her daughter. and the need for prayer, or some kind of personal penitence, though it possibly played a part. I'll explain. For even though she is fine in 1081, it is recorded that Matilda herself had fallen ill sometime during the next year, 1082. So it may have been going on before that. As for the severity, we cannot know for sure, only that there is evidence from around the 1082 mark that Matilda is granting a lot of donations in what is called her last illness. She also writes up her will, so things must have been serious. This isn't a day and age when you write it up when you're 30, just in case. Something was going on. The document itself can be found in La Trinité Incarnée, a very pragmatic list, devoid of emotion, which you would expect from a legal document, though it does contain yet more donations to l'Ancienne Trinité Abbey in Caen, including the contents of her chamber. She even gave them her crown and sceptre, vowing them to be buried in that very abbey. Another point to mention about the Abbeyate of Saint Trinité is that her daughter Cecilia of Normandy was a nun there. By now, Cecilia had completed 17 years of holy service. She's been at the convent since she was a child. She's now in her mid-20s. She was rising in the ranks. One day, she'd be an abbess here. Even so, Matilda wasn't relinquishing any of her royal duties. Oh no, she's a stateswoman to the end. She accompanied her husband to the Abbey of Restain in Normandy, where the Conqueror's own mother was buried. For Helena had passed away many years ago, long before the conquest. But also here at this meeting was Bishop Odo, the king's half-brother. Here, William's aim was to rein in Odo's power, for Odo is the regent of England, and he'd grown considerably powerful. Plus, he's got quite the following at court, and may have supported Robert at some point in time. So William has met his half-brother here, over their mother's grave, to ensure loyalty. This whole church had been built just to house her. But Odo says he doesn't want a mere crown. He makes it abundantly clear, no. He has his eyes on a much higher position. He wants to be Pope. William is no fan of this, because Odo would be away from England where the king cannot keep an eye on him. He could cause all kinds of havoc. He'd be in a position of power where William would have no control over him. But Odo is set on the papacy. Apparently, he planned to head to Rome at the head of an army. It was not looking good. And it's not like Odo's always been loyal to the crown. Only a few years prior he was under trial for fraud, of which he wriggled out of any harsh punishment. William has no choice but to have his half-brother arrested before he could set sail for Rome. Odo was imprisoned for life in Rouen Castle, though it doesn't quite end up that way, more on that later. But as far as Matilda was concerned, this could easily have been Robert, and she must have feared more than ever, as there are cracks in the seams to this new truce between father and son. They were back to the old insults, the arguments, everything from the past resurfacing. Once again, they bent their minds against each other. There was little Matilda could do. The last time William and Robert were recorded with each other was at Caen on the 18th of July in 1083. Matilda was there, After arguments, Robert left court, never to return. We don't know if he ever saw his father again. I mean, he did co-sign a charter on the 9th of January the next year, but father and son may not have crossed paths. There's nothing that says they did, and after that, Robert simply vanishes from records. Records, not history. He's just in exile again, but he's not at court. He's plotting his rebellion. At this very moment, he lacks the manpower to prosecute a war against his father, but he will still try. And the impact this had on Matilda appears to be devastating. She had moved mountains, used every bit of her influence to heal the rift, even getting a pope involved. It was for nothing. Soon after this meeting in Caen, Matilda's health deteriorates sharply, and she will never leave the city. By the winter of 1083, she was gravely ill and on her deathbed. At only 52 years of age, she's by no means old, even in the 11th century, and her mum died in her 70s. But here she was on her deathbed. She's had a rigorous life, along with much childbearing, plus far too much stress, and it all seems to have fallen the great queen. And I will add that there was a plague that hit Normandy around this time, but she was ill long before this is clear. She'd even sought out a holy man only a couple of years back, due to lethargy and illness, so this may have been going on a few years. So I can only conclude that this was an ongoing illness that came and went. Until one morning on the 2nd of November 1083, the day after All Saints' Feast, which Matilda would have spent bedridden. I mean, she's been feeling uneasy. She summoned the clergy, and there Matilda confessed all her sins and received the last rites, passing away that day soon after. Her husband was by her side, right until the end, beside himself with grief. He loved her as with his own soul. Yes, sure, he was a brute and a warlord, but we cannot judge their relationship from a modern-day perspective. This was the 11th century, a foreign place with foreign customs, and William wept for days. He'd lost more than just a beloved wife. He lost a stateswoman, one of the most influential politicians in the kingdom. For 30 years, she had built his foundations. She was irreplaceable, and now she was gone. Her absence was irreparable. The once proud conqueror would never recover from this, entering a deep melancholy, a depressive state that would never leave him. And everywhere, Matilda would be greatly missed. The whole kingdom was in mourning. Church bells rang out across the lands, and Mass was celebrated everywhere. Poems, songs written, carried across far and wide, as the news passed through Europe and beyond. Following her wishes, Matilda's body was interned at the Saint Trinity Abbey in Caen. And boy, was the state funeral lavish. On William's orders, it lasted 2 full days, and he spared no expense. Countless clergy attended, from bishops to monks to nuns, all guiding her light to heaven with their prayers, sharing their heartfelt grief with the rest of the lands. We only know of one of her children who was certainly there, Cecilia of Normandy, because she was a nun at the abbey. Robert was most certainly not. Some say he must, but that would have been recorded. The relationship between he and his father was severed. As for others, Henry and Rufus, they might have been there, maybe even Constance, but this is all speculation, as none of it's recorded. Well, more an educated guess than idle speculation, you know what I mean. After she was laid to rest, a monument was erected over her tomb at the Abbey. King William would never recover from his grief. Prone to mood swings and bitterness, he becomes intolerable, unlikable in every way. Enemies on all sides, including his own family in the form of Robert. William had always been a bullish brute. But whilst before he had Matilda to rein him in, winning over people with her diplomacy and tact, now he simply becomes the tyrant that history knows him for. Just a few short years later, he'd fall from his horse one last time in a routine siege on an unimportant castle, dying soon after. His legacy, it goes two ways. The title, Duke, went to Robert of Normandy, and the crown went to William Rufus. Though this wouldn't last, as Rufus would die in a hunting accident in the same forest his younger brother Richard did all those years ago, and the Duke of Normandy, Robert, gets defeated and ends up being slung in a castle. He ends up dying in Cardiff. Thus, the young Henry, the fourth in line, takes the throne and the dukedom. But that's another story for another time. You know the drill. Anyway, rolling on a bit. One day, this land would become part of France, and France would be gripped centuries later by religious wars, and Matilda's tomb was plundered and broken into during the 16th century. Okay, tangent time. Right, Admiral Gaspar was a Protestant Calvinist, and he looked down upon her skeletal remains and saw a ring upon her finger. A gold ring set with a sapphire. The very one presented at her coronation all those hundreds of years ago. This ring he stole. But thankfully, the abbess there, Anne of Montmorency, was outraged and demanded it be put back, which it was. Oh, and don't mistake Anne de Montmorency from the other Anne de Montmorency, because there are two. One the Abbess of Saint Trinity, and the other is her father, the Marshal of France. Basically, in times gone by, the name Anne was a mixed name, and anyone could use it, male or female. Anyway. Right, so you have Marshal Montmorency. He's a big name in France, and he was even present at Henry VIII's field at the Cloth of Gold Summit. Now, this Marshal was a Catholic through and through, despite the conflict, and his daughter, Anne, the abbess, is also a Catholic, and she runs the abbey. But his sister, Louise, she's a Protestant, a Calvinist. So is her son, Admiral Gaspar. So really this is just a family squabble. Gaspar is told, no, don't be a pillock, and the ring remains. Later, during the 17th century, Matilda's remains were placed in a small casket and reburied, and a new monument was made for this occasion. Of course, then along came the French Revolution, and the monument was destroyed. Though, not her casket. That was spared. So finally, Matilda was left in peace. And during the 19th century, the original 11th century tombstone was restored and placed over. That's the one we see today. finally giving closure to the story of Matilda. So there you have it. The history of Matilda of Flanders, the high-born daughter of a count come Queen of England. She's shaken the rafters of 11th century Europe in a day and age riddled with misogyny and oppression. She kept her head above the water where many women didn't. Even when her husband tried his hardest to make her a kept woman, even he understood her importance, and we all know how things fell apart when Matilda passed away. Without her, William was not a good king, though he hogged all the credit. This is typical for the time. Typical for now. Even Matilda's contemporaries, though, tell of just how much of a stateswoman she was, a diplomat until the end, one of the pillars of the earth in the courts of England and Normandy. My only regret in all of this is the sheer lack of information, not just regarding Matilda, but anyone. There are dark patches in every part of the story, and even when the light shines, it is often cloudy and grey. That is the curse of the transition period from early to high medieval in history. My other regret is having not visited her tomb in Caen at Saint-Trinity. But due to time constraints and cash, alas. This means, though, I will leave one last chapter open for the future, for when I do. Because it is a beautiful monument to the old medieval world. So, there she is, the mother of kings, Matilda of Flanders, her lineage spanning centuries, one of our greatest monarchs. Thank you for watching.